When I first bought the house in the neighborhood, I thought I had finally found the perfect place to build a life. The streets were quiet, children played outside, and most neighbors smiled and waved when you passed by. The lake nearby shimmered in the evenings, and the whole setting felt like the peaceful escape I had always wanted. But from the very beginning, there was one person who didn't seem to fit that picture. Karen, the HOA president. She had a sharp tongue and a permanent scowl behind her forced smile. The kind of person who always seemed to be watching. She would walk around the block with a clipboard, making notes about people's lawns or trash bins, and everyone whispered about how she fined families for the smallest things. I kept my head down, paid my dues, and avoided her whenever possible. For a while, that strategy worked. I minded my own business, and though I could see how much control Karen tried to exercise over the neighborhood, I figured if I stayed quiet, she'd leave me alone. Then I got married. My wife Claire was everything Karen wasn't. Kind, calm, and strong-willed. The day she moved in should have been a happy milestone for us, but instead it marked the beginning of the worst kind of drama. As we carried boxes from the car to the porch, Karen stood across the street with her arms folded, glaring at Claire as if she had no right to be there. At first, I thought it was just her usual nosiness, but it quickly became obvious it was more. She didn't just disapprove. She was planning to interfere. By the end of that very same day, I realized Karen wasn't going to stop at dirty looks or muttered comments. She was about to cross a line none of us expected. We had barely gotten halfway through unloading Claire's boxes when Karen marched straight across the street like she owned the place. Her heels clicked against the pavement, her clipboard tucked tightly under one arm. She didn't even bother with a greeting. Instead, she jabbed a finger toward Claire and demanded, "Where's your HOA residency paperwork?" Claire blinked, confused, then laughed softly as if it were a joke. But Karen wasn't joking. She repeated herself louder this time, insisting that all new residents must be board approved. I stepped in, explaining that Claire was my wife and that the house was mine, owned outright. Karen smirked and shook her head like I was a child who didn't understand the rules. "That doesn't matter," she snapped. "Everyone who lives here has to go through the board. Those are the regulations." Claire, who had spent years in property law, stood her ground. Calmly she said, "I don't need your approval to live with my husband in his own home." Karen's face turned red. She muttered something about violations and stormed off, waving her clipboard like it was a weapon. I thought that would be the end of it, just another one of her empty power plays. But 15 minutes later, the flashing lights of a police cruiser rolled down the street. Two officers stepped out, one hand resting on his belt as he walked up the driveway. Karen stood nearby, smug as ever, arms crossed, clearly proud of herself. She had called 911 and reported a suspicious woman trespassing. I couldn't believe it. I quickly showed the officers my deed, ID, and even our marriage certificate. Claire remained calm, answering their questions politely. Within minutes, the officers realized what was going on. They apologized, shook my hand, and drove off. Karen, though, still wore that smug smile. She thought she had won some kind of battle. What she didn't realize was that she had just started a war she could never win. The police leaving should have embarrassed Karen, but instead it only seemed to fuel her fire. The next morning, I found a bright yellow violation notice taped to my front door. It claimed that Claire was an unauthorized occupant, and that we were in violation of HOA residency rules. The fine was laughable, $500 a week until the issue was resolved. I tore the paper down and crumpled it, but Claire took it from my hand and smoothed it out. She studied it carefully, her brow furrowed, and then she smiled. That was the first time I realized she wasn't just going to let Karen push us around. Claire had dealt with HOAs before in her career, and she recognized overreach when she saw it. "She just made a huge mistake," Claire said. "She thinks she's untouchable, but this is illegal." Over the next few days, Karen doubled down. She paced in front of our house, peered into the windows under the guise of inspection, and even shouted once that Claire had no legal right to be on the property. Neighbors noticed, of course. Some shook their heads in sympathy, but others seemed too afraid of Karen to say a word. It was clear she had ruled the HOA for so long that everyone assumed she could do whatever she wanted. Claire, though, wasn't intimidated. She pulled out binders of documents she had kept from past cases and started gathering information about our HOA. She requested public filings, combed through bylaws, and highlighted section after section that Karen had been abusing. It turned out the residency rule Karen kept throwing at us didn't exist anywhere in the governing documents. It was something she had invented to keep control. When Claire showed me the evidence, my jaw dropped. Karen wasn't just bluffing, she was breaking the law, and she'd been doing it for years. What she didn't know was that she had just picked a fight with the one person in the neighborhood who knew exactly how to dismantle her little empire. Karen must have sensed that Claire wasn't going to back down, because her behavior grew even more hostile. Within the week, we received 3 more violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. One claimed our window blinds did not match community standards. Another insisted our front lawn was improperly landscaped, because Claire had placed a few flower pots near the porch. The third was almost laughable. It fined us for unauthorized street parking, even though the car listed was registered to our driveway. Each paper carried Karen's bold signature at the bottom, as if she wanted to personally stamp her authority on every threat. Claire, however, didn't flinch. She stacked the notices in a neat pile on the kitchen table and said calmly, "Every single one of these is evidence." While I was still fuming about Karen's harassment, Claire was already thinking 2 steps ahead. She began drafting letters back to the HOA, demanding proof of the so-called rules, and citing the exact sections of state housing law that made their claims invalid. Her precision left me in awe. Every word she wrote was sharp, calculated, and unshakable. Meanwhile, Karen's arrogance grew. She strutted around the neighborhood, loudly telling anyone who would listen that she was handling the trespasser situation. I overheard her one evening boasting that she would have Claire out within the month. It was infuriating, but I trusted Claire's calm smile more than Karen's empty threats. Behind the scenes, Claire was also documenting everything. Photos of the notices, recordings of Karen shouting on the street, even the timestamps of her clipboard inspections. She built a timeline so detailed it looked like a legal case file. And truthfully, that's exactly what it was becoming. What Karen didn't know was that while she was busy trying to intimidate us with phony fines, Claire was building the very case that would end her reign for good. It wasn't just about us anymore, it was about ever. It didn't take long before Claire uncovered just how deep Karen's abuse of power went. Late one evening, I found her at the dining table surrounded by a fortress of papers. She had gotten hold of the HOA's financial reports, minutes from past meetings, and the official bylaws. As she flipped through page after page, her eyes narrowed with every discovery. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a line in the budget where thousands of dollars had been marked as miscellaneous expenses. Another section showed repeated fines collected from homeowners, but never properly accounted for. The numbers didn't add up, and it was clear someone, Karen, had been treating the HOA's money like her own. Claire also found that Karen had been fabricating rules to maintain control. There was no mention anywhere about needing board approval for residents, no clauses about matching blinds, and no requirement banning flower pots. Most of the so-called regulations were things Karen had typed up on her own letterhead, banking on the fact that nobody would challenge her. The realization hit me hard. She hadn't just targeted us. She'd been doing this to everyone for years, and most people probably paid the fines just to avoid conflict. The next step was gathering witnesses. Claire started quietly talking to neighbors, and soon, stories poured out. One family had been fined $2,000 for putting up a swing set. Another elderly couple paid weekly penalties for their non-compliant shutters. Everyone had been too afraid to stand up to Karen, but when they learned Claire was a property lawyer, their fear turned to cautious hope. By then, Karen had no idea the noose was tightening. She thought her threats and bogus fines would scare us into submission, but instead they were strengthening our case. Claire was methodical, patient, and relentless. She wasn't just preparing to challenge Karen. She was preparing to expose her. And I could see it in her eyes. When the moment came, Karen wouldn't even know. The breaking point came one sunny Saturday morning when Karen pushed things too far. Claire and I had just finished breakfast when we heard a knock on the door, sharp, impatient, and familiar. Sure enough, Karen stood there with her clipboard, flanked by two board members who looked more uncomfortable than supportive. Without even saying hello, she announced, "This is your final warning. If your wife doesn't vacate the premises by Monday, we will begin foreclosure proceedings." For a moment, I was stunned into silence. Foreclosure? Over my wife living in her own home? Claire, though, didn't blink. She calmly asked, "On what legal grounds?" Karen puffed up like a cat, rattling off her usual nonsense about HOA regulations and community standards. But before she could finish, Claire pulled a folder from the side table by the door. Inside was every piece of evidence she had collected. Dozens of violation notices, highlighted sections of the bylaws, financial inconsistencies, and even sworn statements from neighbors. She handed a copy to each board member, her voice steady as she said, "Actually, it's you who are in violation of state housing law and fiduciary duty. This is a formal notice of legal action." The board members shifted uncomfortably, flipping through the documents. Karen tried to dismiss it as a scare tactic, but her voice cracked just slightly. Claire didn't raise her tone, didn't get angry. She simply laid out the facts, citing exact statutes and previous court rulings that made Karen's threats meaningless. Then she dropped the final bombshell. "You'll want to prepare a defense, because in 20 minutes you'll be served." Karen froze. The color drained from her face as Claire stepped back inside and made a quick call. True to her word, within half an hour, a process server walked up the driveway and handed Karen a thick envelope of eviction papers. Not for us, but for her. Karen's world, built on years of intimidation, had just begun to crumble. The sight of Karen being served at our front door sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Word spread faster than wildfire, and by evening, groups of neighbors gathered in driveways whispering about what had happened. Some couldn't hide their smiles, while others were cautious, afraid of what Karen might do next. For years, she had controlled them with fines, threats, and gossip. Now, for the first time, people saw that she wasn't untouchable. Karen, however, didn't go quietly. She stormed back across the street, waving the papers in the air like they were meaningless. "This is a joke," she yelled loud enough for the whole block to hear. "You can't evict me. I'm the HOA president." But her bravado rang hollow. The process server had been clear. The case wasn't just about her harassment of us. It was about her mismanagement of HOA funds, her abuse of authority, and her violation of state laws governing community associations. Claire had built a case that reached far beyond petty fines. The following days were tense. Karen doubled her patrols, marching up and down the street, clipboard in hand, barking at anyone who so much as left a trash can out too long. But her grip was slipping. Homeowners who once cowered now avoided her altogether. And some even whispered encouragement to us when she wasn't looking. A few brave souls began sharing their own violation letters with Claire, each one strengthening the evidence. Behind the scenes, Claire filed motions, compiled testimony, and prepared for the upcoming hearing. Her calm confidence contrasted sharply with Karen's frantic behavior. I watched in awe as my wife balanced her career and this neighborhood crusade without missing a beat. It was clear now that this was bigger than us. It was about freeing an entire community from Karen's reign of fear. And while Karen stomped around clinging to her clipboard, everyone else began to see her for what she really was. A bully on borrowed time. The day of the court hearing finally arrived, and the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt electric. Some of the neighbors even took time off work to sit in the gallery, eager to see the showdown between Karen and Claire. For years, Karen had been the self-proclaimed queen of the community, but now she stood at the defendant's table, clutching her papers and glaring across the room. Claire, in sharp contrast, looked calm and collected, her legal file neatly organized in front of her. I sat just behind her, nervous but proud, knowing she had prepared for this moment down to the smallest detail. When the judge entered and the case was called, Claire stood tall and began laying out the evidence. She spoke with precision, walking the court through each bogus violation notice, each financial discrepancy, and each testimony from neighbors who had suffered under Karen's so-called rules. She pointed to the bylaws, highlighting the exact passages Karen had ignored or twisted. Then she presented the financial records, showing how thousands of dollars in fines had vanished into miscellaneous expenses, with no paper trail. Every detail was backed by documents, signatures, and law. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice shrill and desperate. She claimed Claire was twisting the truth and accused the neighbors of conspiring against her. But each time she spoke, the judge cut her off and asked for evidence. Karen had none, only her word, her arrogance, and her clipboard full of empty threats. The contrast between her bluster and Claire's professionalism couldn't have been clearer. By the time Claire finished, the courtroom was silent except for the judge scribbling notes. Even the neighbors in the gallery seemed stunned, whispering to each other about how thoroughly Karen had been dismantled. For the first time in years, Karen wasn't the one in control. She was cornered, and the outcome was no longer in her hands. When the judge finally spoke, the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward. His tone was firm, deliberate, and left no room for argument. He declared that Karen had acted far outside the scope of her authority as HOA president, inventing rules that didn't exist, misusing funds, and repeatedly harassing residents under false pretenses. Each violation Claire had highlighted was validated in the judge's ruling. It was more than just a loss for Karen. It was a complete dismantling of her credibility. The judge's orders were clear. Karen was to step down immediately as HOA president and was barred from serving on any future board. The HOA itself was placed under review, with a temporary administrator appointed to restore proper financial practices and return misused funds to the community. But the final blow came when the judge upheld the eviction notice. Karen, who had long weaponized fines and threats to control others, now had 30 days to vacate her own home for failure to meet her fiduciary obligations. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. She stammered, tried to argue, even begged for leniency, but the gavel struck, and the decision was final. Neighbors who had been silent for years exchanged looks of relief, some even smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. The weight Karen had held over everyone was finally broken. As we left the courthouse, people clapped Claire on the back, thanking her for what she had done. She hadn't just defended us, she had freed the entire community. Watching Karen storm out of the courtroom, her clipboard clutched uselessly against her chest, I couldn't help but think of how quickly power crumbles when it's built on lies. For the first time in years, the neighborhood's future looked brighter, and it was all because Karen had finally been held accountable. Life after Karen's downfall felt like stepping into a completely different neighborhood. The tension that once hung over every interaction slowly faded, replaced by a sense of relief and even celebration. Neighbors who had been hiding behind closed doors began coming out again, chatting freely on sidewalks, hosting barbecues, and waving as we passed. The fear that Karen's clipboard once carried was gone, and in its place was a community finally free to breathe. The temporary administrator worked with residents to rebuild trust. Misused funds were tracked, and in some cases, partial reimbursements were issued. But more importantly, new elections were held, and a fair, transparent board was chosen. For the first time, homeowners had leaders who actually listened, who wanted the neighborhood to thrive rather than live under constant surveillance. Meetings became productive instead of confrontational, and decisions were made openly without hidden agendas. For Claire and me, the change was personal, too. No more fines taped to our door, no more tense mornings watching Karen pace outside, no more calls to the police over made-up complaints. We could finally enjoy our home the way it was meant to be enjoyed. Sitting together on the porch one evening, Claire smiled and said, "Funny how she thought calling 911 would get rid of me. Instead, it got rid of her." We laughed, knowing just how true that was. The eviction itself became a quiet but symbolic event. Karen packed up and left, refusing to look at anyone as she drove away. Watching her go, I felt no gloating, just relief. Her departure marked the end of an era of fear, and the beginning of something better. Claire hadn't just defended her right to live here. She had given everyone back their peace. And every time I look at her, I'm reminded that sometimes the greatest victories are not about winning battles, but about restoring balance where it was stolen.